standing. Please. Assume he'll tell me or something. Yeah. Ready? Okay, do you want to shut the door maybe? All right, good evening. Welcome to our July Functional Forum. We're pleased to have you here, all of those here and those of you that might be online with us. Tonight's topic is a fascinating one. We're going to hit it for about an hour or so, and we'll just take a little piece of it, take a little bite out of it perhaps. We're talking about the mind versus the brain, who's really in charge. This is a conversation that's been going on for centuries. Did you know it takes the average person 10 years to get get help for their mental health symptoms? Your kids can't afford to wait that long. So let's talk about what you can do today to change your family's story. So oftentimes we are asked this question, is there research on neurotherapy? Our straightforward answer is yes. Just ask Google Scholar. This is a statistic from about a month ago that gives you some clear indication of how much research there is in the field of neurotherapy. So I'd like to start us kind of looking at this idea of changing the trajectory of family by sharing a case study with you. So I'm going to start talking about the case study now. Then we'll move into talking about some theory around this mind versus brain. And then eventually we'll come back to the case study with some live demonstration that will talk with you a little bit about the things that we can do to change the trajectory that can happen in a family. So this case study is a case study about chaos and the impact of chaos on the brain. I was born into a family, a large family. I was the youngest of 7 kids, born into a household of 3 bedrooms and 10 people living in that household. My maternal grandmother lived with us. She mostly did parenting for me because my mother had been exhausted by this time. Lots of people, lots of noise, lots of chaos. Add to that, parents who had a difficult relationship with alcohol, which made them unavailable emotionally, made them unavailable financially, causing a sense of uncertainty and overwhelm and fear from a very early age. I would say that I was born into chaos and probably lived in chaos in utero as well. So my system became very accustomed to chaos and uncertainty and fear. And of course, as any developing brain would have to do, it has to learn to adjust or you perish in some way, either physically or mentally. And so chaos became more chaos. When I was 8, one of my sisters died with 5 of her friends in a tragic car accident, and that took my unavailable parents and rendered them unavailable for the rest of time. And then add to that, when I was 15 years old, my grandma, who had been my mother, I found her dead in our bedroom. More chaos, more uncertainty, more fear. That same year, experienced an assault outside of the home. And then fast forward into my early adulthood, in my mid-20s, my father died one year, my mother the next year, and my older sister the following year. So my brain had become very patterned. And so what I want to do today is talk a little bit about how that ties into how much of what happened to me is, in terms of how I responded to that environment, has to do with brain, and how much of that has to do with mind. So these are the perspectives we're going to consider. We're going to talk about these 4 perspectives as we kind of consider this question of mind versus brain, Who's in control? How do they interact with each other? How are they related? I'm going to spend some time talking with you about Daniel Siegel's framework for the mind. So Daniel Siegel is well known in the field of psychology. He's a neuroscientist. He really kind of did some groundbreaking work, really ruffled a lot of feathers in the science field, and particularly in the neuroscience field early on, when he started to suggest that the mind actually wasn't just locked into your skull, that it actually included more than just the brain. And so this is his quote of what the mind is: an embodied and relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information. So let's take that apart a little bit. Embodied means that the mind is not only locked in the brain, but it's also connected to the body. So this was a really, unpopular bit of information or idea at the time, but then came, people started to get on board, and so now mind-body psychology is something that everybody is talking about all the time. Siegel takes that further, and he talks about the idea of this embodied relational process. So relational becomes a pretty significant divergence from the way we had been thinking about the mind. So relational suggests that there is some kind of interaction that the mind has. And what Siegel was talking about is the idea that the mind is not only in the brain and in the body, but is also in interactions between each other and in your interaction with the environment. And so he talks about this idea of an energy flow and an information flow. So the energy flow is really just electrical activity. It's it's a capacity for change, a change potential. And then the information that is kind of flowing, interacting with the energy is more about a pattern of that energy that becomes symbolic. So for example, if I were just to blow out a breath of air, if you're standing close enough to me, you could hear that there is some energy there. There's a sound wave, just the sound of my breath, right? That's all it is. It doesn't mean anything in particular. You would just note, breath sound waves, right? If I stand here and say to you, Statue of Liberty, suddenly all of this, which was just, by the way, energy coming out of my mouth, sound waves coming out of my mouth, has some kind of meaning to you, right? And so what Siegel is talking about with mind is this idea of this flow of information and energy. So the energy or the information becomes like equivalent to like our thoughts, our feelings, our intentions, our perceptions, that sort of thing. And so what Siegel says the mind does is regulates that flow of energy and information. He uses this model for the brain. I love this model. You guys might just want to put your hand up and kind of follow this model. If you put your hand up in a fist, close your thumbs in behind your fingers there, and take a look at your hand and notice the palm and the wrist area. That is what would be the equivalent of like your brain stem, basic survival functions, that sort of thing. Then if you look at your thumb, it's tucked in under the rest of those fingers, right? And that thumb represents the limbic system, the amygdala, some other structures. The limbic system is kind of your emotion center, and so notice that it's tucked inside the brain there. And then covering the limbic system are those other 4 fingers of yours. That is the cerebral cortex, the executive control center, and so the part of the brain that controls or helps to manage emotion, right? And so you see Siegel in his model has the hands open up in the palm. That's his idea of what happens when we flip our lid, right? When we can't emotionally regulate, is that emotion or the executive center loses kind of the plot and isn't able to regulate. So the brain becomes this embodied mechanism through which the mind can operate, right? What I really like about Siegel's model is when I look at this, when I do this and I look at the wrist area, it's so obvious that it's connected to more, right? It is not like if my wrist and my hand is my brain, there's a whole lot more below my wrist. And that's that idea of it being connected. Oh, not sure what that was. Where Siegel really got radical in terms of his idea about the mind is when he brought in this idea of this like relational dynamic, right? And so this triangle represents what Siegel talks about in regards to the interplay between the mind and the brain and relationships. So the brain is that mechanism that kind of keeps regulating all of that energy flow and information that's coming from the mind. And so those two are interacting with one another. And if you think about the idea of interaction, typically it's not just a one-way thing. Even if if I was interacting with somebody and the other person wasn't speaking, there's still interaction happening, right? There's still a lot of interplay happening there. So the process is happening between the brain and the mind. And then Siegel talks about this idea of relationships and the environment as having playing a role in this dynamic process. So the idea that relationships can shape and also be shaped by the brain and mind. Same thing with environment. So if you think back to the case study that I shared, just keep that in mind and hold that, as kind of backdrop information about how relationship and environment can influence that flow of energy and information. And then Siegel brings into his theory this idea of the wheel of awareness. And so this is the place where when we look at the things that we do in the Brain Health Clinic with neurotherapy, this is where we really start to kind of pull in our work with the brain and the mind. So the neurotherapy itself can really focus on changing circuitry in the brain. So we could think about it as kind of the hardwire part of the brain, but we don't do just that. In this process of interacting with an individual who's doing neurotherapy, we have all kinds of opportunity to enhance and create more of an integration as awareness is created. So this wheel of awareness that Siegel talks about is made up, so if you look at the hub right in the middle, you see that it represents the awareness. And then you notice the rim around there has a lot of different components to it. And then you see where the word attention is and that black arrow is. That's what is referred to as the spoke of the wheel, right? So it's a wheel. The hub is really about your sense of knowing, right? That's the awareness piece, your capacity to be conscious. And then as we move around the rim, we see that it also includes the first 5 senses. So that's those common senses we think of: taste, touch, smell, hearing. And then we move on to looking at bodily sensations. So that's, bodily sensations are really interoception, right? My ability to be able to kind of sense internally the state I might have, like how my system might be feeling internally. And then the 7th sense that Siegel talks about is mental activities. And so that includes thoughts, perceptions, interpretations, intentions, feelings, those sorts of things. And then that 8th sense that is on the rim of this wheel of awareness is that interconnection piece. And again, that piece is about connecting with other people. It's also about the connection with that energy that we talked about with the mind, that energy flow and the environment, right? So what Siegel talks about is this idea of this dynamic interplay that happens, and this wheel gives us information about where it is that we tend to place our focus. Right? And so if my focus is specifically on my outer world, right, my five senses, that's going to, if you think about Siegel's theory, that is going to have some, that impact, that interplay is going to have some impact in terms of kind of my mind and my brain. It has a tendency to be able to start to shape those things as well. If my attention is focused on interconnection. So maybe my attention is focused into the environment that I'm in. So think about chaos in an environment and how that energy of chaos interacts with the energy flow of the mind and the information flow, and how they can kind of shape one another. So when we're doing neurotherapy, we have opportunity to work with this all of the time. We can work with somebody who's sitting in a chair, just sitting watching a plane being flown through a hoop, and work with them on getting better at being able to move their attention from all the thoughts that are going on in their head, those mental activities, to maybe their bodily sensations, right? So bring them in to kind of focus on what's going on internally, and to be able to create some sense of awareness of state. In the process of doing that, what Siegel talks about is that idea that all of these kind of characters in the game can shape each other, right? So as we learn to bring our attention inward perhaps, or to notice a particular state, and then to maybe try and make some change to move to a different state, that can start to have an impact on what we see happening in terms of neural activity in the brain. And if we practice that enough, it can create that neural circuitry that will have that tendency to move in that direction. And so in this really exciting way, we can take this dynamic process and really help somebody to be able to kind of move to a different place in terms of their ability to interact in the environment. Siegel brings in this idea of mind sight, which is really his term for cultivating awareness, right? That awareness that I talked about. So I want you all to close your eyes for a minute. And I want you to say out loud quietly, I am sad. And then I want you to take a moment to feel how that feels. And if you need to say, I am sad again, say it. And let yourself notice how that feels. I am sad. Okay, go ahead and open your eyes. Anybody want to share their experience, what that feels like? Okay, yep. Okay, so it's grabbing your throat, kind of, yep, okay, yep. Heaviness in your lungs, okay, yeah, yep, okay. So I want you to close your eyes again. And I want you to say, I feel sad. And I want you to notice your state when you say, I feel sad. And then I want you to say, I am sad. And notice your state. And then I feel sad. Okay, so go ahead and open your eyes. Do you notice any difference between your state when you say I am sad and you say I feel sad? Yeah? Do you want to share? You're nodding your head. Do you want to share? Yep, yep.
When I said I am sad, I really felt it in my body. But when I said I feel sad, I didn't.
Okay.
The wrong reaction.
Interesting. So the wrong reaction. Okay. So here's what happens. So Siegel talks about this, uses this idea of mind sight to help us really learn how to step back and become the observer, right? So when you say, I am sad, that sense of heaviness becomes you, right? And we're saying, it's here, right here in me. When you say, I feel sad, you now have you and sad, as opposed to I am sad, right? And that opens up space for you to be able to kind of step back and observe yourself feeling sad. And what this can allow for then, as you do that process, is for that regulator, the mind, to be able to help manage the emotion as opposed to feeling the overwhelm. And then Siegel talks about that idea as you engage in mind sight, cultivating that awareness over time, the idea being that you start to integrate the brain. And he uses this acronym of FACES as kind of the identifying a well-integrated brain, a brain that's flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. And Siegel would say, when the brain is integrated, that leads to a sense of well-being. When it's non-integrated, it leads to chaos or rigidity. So we're going to come back and visit chaos in a little bit later when we do our demo, and we'll take a look at how chaos can be changed through the process of neurotherapy. So you all, I'm imagining, have seen this before. So blue-black or white-gold?
I was always blue-black.
Blue-black, 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 blue-black. Who's white-gold and doesn't want to say it because now you feel like it's the wrong thing? I see white-gold. Does anybody else see white-gold?
White-gold earlier in the speech, but now I'm blue.
Yeah. Why do you suppose that is? Aha. Yeah, you just want to be a part of the group. Yep. So I can actually make myself see blue-black if I do just the right thing with my eyes and have just the right amount of lighting. So this, I think, is a really good demonstration of this idea of how the brain kind of works together with the mind to create information flows that help to inform us about life, right? And so in this example, the brain is, remember, it's that embodied mechanism that is kind of the energy and information processor. So it's really doing the sensory thing. So it's the thing that's looking at just the visual stimuli that's coming in. And then the mind, with its symbolic patterning, remember we talked about the symbolic pattern, that, by the way, is typically going to be influenced by something previously, which is part of what you see in the predictive processing. Two different theories, but they complement each other some. The mind is really kind of giving meaning based on a lot of different things. If you look at the research and why people see blue-black or white-gold, they talk about the idea of color constancy. And that idea being that if your mind looks at this picture and perceives it like mine does as a dress that's hanging in a shop somewhere, the reason my mind sees that is there are no arms that I can see here. And I see bright light, and this looks to me like something I would see in a shop somewhere. If your mind looks at it and tends to see this as, I don't know, a dress you might see out at a nightclub or a party or something like that, your mind is going to use that information, and it's going to, that color constancy, it's going to take that information and just create that interpretation of that color. Okay, so I'm going to pass this off to Guy.
Hey, you want to let me know? Is that good? Yep. Okay. Wonderful. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper into kind of some of the history, the approaches to kind of the brain-mind difference. Fran touched on it just kind of briefly as she went into her talk. I'll talk a little bit about how does Dan Siegel's approach fit into this, and then go into some examples, and then, like Fran, kind of end with a little tangible experience for us. So starting off, this idea of kind of the physical or materialism, probably not a surprise to any of us, right? That we kind of have this legacy that we're still trying to recover from, of kind of a reductionist, materialist past. And I say past, I mean, that's probably my own bias coming in, as much as I would like it to be a past, but still very much present today. We'll see, in a lot of our Western medicine still, functions as if the body is a machine. We have parts. If a part is malfunctioning, you can just take it out. The presumption is you'll be fine, or put another part in, replace a knee or a shoulder, and everything keeps going, right? So that's the kind of basic idea of this idea of kind of physicalism or materialism. And there, what they see the mind as nothing other than the activity of the brain. Right? So you've maybe heard this somewhere along the line that to be put in some of the jargon would be that the mind is an epiphenomena of the brain. Right? It is just the byproduct of activity. There is no thing called the mind, right? In that approach. Then we go forward a little bit and we go into kind of dualism. And then this was the beginning of positing, well, maybe the mind is actually something. It isn't just the activity of the brain, but it's still keeping them as different, right? So you could see much of my time kind of working in holistic health is, I came in at the beginning of this idea of the mind-body connection, right? So why did we need to have decades of education around mind-body connection? And it's because we had centuries of mind-body as separate things. Right? So then we needed to heal that split, so healing the dualism, and come back to this idea that maybe they're related, right? And you can even hear in part of what Fran shared in Dan Siegel's work, this idea of kind of integrating. Well, you only have to integrate things that are separate, right? Like you don't have to integrate your finger into your hand. It's already there, right? So that's still kind of recovering from this idea of duality and that they're different. So then kind of dip into a little bit into kind of some Eastern thought here. So this is Vedanta mostly is kind of one of the probably the most well-known kind of non-dual school in here. And so for them, there is no sense of, kind of like a mind-body difference. They certainly talk about aspects of our existence and have names for different aspects of how we manifest different functions and capacities. But in that way of thinking, the way of conceiving existence, they're not separate, right? Again, back to my hand as an example, they're just parts of a whole. And in the naming it as a part is just as a conception, it's a convention. But other than the fact that we call this a finger and this a thumb and this a palm, they're actually not separate in any way. And they need nothing needs to be done to make them an integrated whole. They just already are that, right? So that's where kind of Vedanta, many of the Eastern traditions started from that place. And so they didn't have to recover. I mean, maybe they did 5,000 years ago, but they've had a good run of not having that dualistic split. And then we go into the work of Michael Levin. And so I'm a fan of his approach. And one of the things that I like about him, we're going to get into a little bit of his science, what he's demonstrating. But he's bringing this perspective, kind of the Vedanta perspective, into Western scientific thought. So you can hear some fantastic talks that he does with other researchers at elite universities and hear them talk, and you might think that they're talking Eastern philosophy, but they're talking Western science. Right? And I think for me, the exciting thing is seeing this come into the Western academic perspective. And then why I'm a fan of Michael Levin is he's actually taking this into the lab and doing experiments to show that it's true. So it's taking it out of philosophy and turning it just a practical application. And one of the things that he's doing a really good job of articulating is the necessity and the value of that. The things that his lab have discovered because they've brought this idea in, these things were not discoverable under these other perspectives. So somebody functioning under a materialism, a reductionist approach, would never think to do the types of experiments that he does, and therefore would not make the discoveries that he has made. Right? So he's really taking biology and breaking the paradigm, and a lot of what he's showing is also challenging the paradigm of psychology, sociology, cosmology, philosophy. And that's pretty powerful body of knowledge to bring forward to have a ripple effect across all of those academic domains. And so his idea is much like the Vedantists, is that there's no separation, that the physical and mind coexist at every level. Right? Now he sticks mostly to biology, but others are taking his theory and applying it to physics, chemistry, again, psychology, sociology, cosmology, and are finding that it fits. And not just fits, but they can produce evidence, which again, for Michael Levin, that's a necessity, no philosophy. If you can't do an experiment to prove it, he's not interested in talking about it. So here's a little summary of all of this. So as Fran had said, so for Dan Siegel, it's this idea of mind is that which orchestrates the flow of energy and information. Right? So it's actually a really elegant definition that he came up with working with a large group, about 50 other academics in different disciplines. And their goal was to come up with a definition of mind that didn't violate any one discipline's principles. And so this was kind of generic enough to encompass everybody in that room when they worked on and creating a number of kind of perspectives within his approach, the interpersonal neurobiology. Yeah. So Dan Siegel's is the definition of mind is that which orchestrates the flow of energy and information. Yep. And so for Michael Levin, his framework is called TAME, so technological approach to mind everywhere. And I think like he put it right there in the name, right? As much as his area of expertise is biology, he does really presume that it is likely that mind exists on every level. He stays in his wheelhouse, but he certainly talks to other researchers that have shown that there's intelligence on the level of atoms, intelligence on the level of chemistry, and of course, I think we would all agree that there's probably intelligence on the level of society and kind of intercultural exchange. That now maybe becomes a question of, is there mind or intelligence kind of on an interplanetary level, right? That might go back into open for conversation, but that's what he would posit, is that there's mind arising, co-merging at every level. So there's, again, no split. So here's some of Michael Levin's work. What I don't know is if I get to have, it does not show my cursor up there, does it? So that makes it challenging because then the pointer also doesn't work on TVs. So hard for me to point to you. So if we start in the upper left corner there, so what you're seeing in that image is the face of a tadpole before the biology forms. So you see the outline of a face, an eye, a nose, a mouth. Right, so beginning to see the beginnings of a face. That is only an electromagnetic field that has come into being that the cells will migrate to, and that electromagnetic field holds information that will tell those cells what to become. Become an eye cell, become a mouth cell, become a gill cell, whatever. So there's a bioelectric field that holds that information that is informing the physical matter in part of what to do, right? So there's this collaboration between mind and matter that brings the tadpole to life. So the next image over is a tumor that they've induced, so using a bioelectric field to induce a tumor by disconnecting cells from the collective mind in this fish. When they bioelectrically disconnect it from the group mind, that those cells revert to an earlier single cell form and basically cancer, right? And that's Michael Levin's theory on cancer is they're normal healthy cells that have disconnected from the collective mind. So they're now operating on a lower level mind, and then to the rest of the body, they're cancer. To the cancer cells, the rest of the body is just environment, right? Like they're just doing what their current program is because they've lost the program of being part of the larger collective. So he's been able to show that you can both induce a tumor by disconnecting, but you can resolve a tumor by reconnecting those cells to the collective mind. They go back to being whatever cell they were before. So then kind of lower left, you have the beginning of an eye. So what he was able to do is kind of deliver into a tadpole the instructions for build an eye here, right? So you can just turn on the algorithm for build an eye here. And sure enough, a number of the cells start to become eye cells, all of the different differentiated types of cells that are needed to make an eye. And indeed, he's been able to have, like again, on a tadpole, to grow an eye on the tail that gets wired in and the animal can see with it. Right? So again, proof of concept that by understanding the pattern of mind that says these are the instructions to make an eye, you introduce those instructions to a set of cells that are just skin cells, that they will get busy making an eye. Right? So next to that, we see a frog. You see the top picture, the frog is missing part of its leg. Bottom picture, it's almost completed regrowing that leg. So this is regenerative medicine. Frogs don't normally regenerate their limbs, but again, they figured out what is the mind, what is the bioelectric signal to turn on the grow a leg here subroutine and then regrow a leg. And it will grow from beginning to end and stop when a perfect frog leg has been produced. No micromanaging, no telling it what to do, just give it one instruction and it follows it to completion. So upper right, so this is where they've taken a planaria, so a small little worm. They've induced a memory into a normal planaria that has one head and one tail to have two heads. So now this animal is swimming along, just minding its own business. It's got one head, one tail, having a good day. You cut it. Both halves will regenerate, but they will regenerate two heads, no tail, because he had induced a latent memory for how to have two heads. Right? So again, showing that you can bring mind into relationship with physical matter, and that mind will change what happens. Yeah? And then the bottom, this is, so, you know, in many ways kind of what Fran and I do, what the team here does is in neurofeedback, operant conditioning, right? So that's Pavlov, and that's pairing a stimulus with, say, in the case of Pavlov and the dog, a bell and food, and eventually the dog salivates to the bell, right? So just pairing operant conditioning. So what they've been able to do is operant conditioning in a genetic network, right? So this is not interfacing with like a brain and a mind of an animal that we typically think of, right? But in a gene expression network that those networks show 6 different styles of learning. So they picked a style of learning, so a gene regulatory network, they paired it with a stimulus, and they were able to reprogram how that network functioned. So one, that's amazing in and of itself, that your gene regulatory network can learn, and it can learn how to do something different. And in this case, one of the ways they're using it is in drug conditioning. So getting a gene regulatory network to respond to a drug, to a pharmaceutical, and then pairing that with essentially, say, sugar, so a placebo. And then that network will respond to the placebo the same way it responded to the medication, to the drug. Right? So the idea being that if you could do that, you could withdraw the actual medication and you could get the same response from a placebo, but you would train that response first. Right? And any number of variations on that theme. But again, to me, the amazing thing is they had the idea that this was possible. They developed an experiment to be able to experimentally show that it was possible. And once understanding that a gene regulatory network had 6 different learning styles, they picked a learning style and they started training them to be able to do different things. Right? And so, again, this idea of operant conditioning, we aren't all that surprised about it at the level of our mind, right? We were like, oh, of course. But if we don't have the possibility that something on these other levels have a mind, you would never presume you could interact with it, train it, it could learn. Right? It also just generally speaks to us about our health and how our bodies, any given function, our liver, our kidney, again, a gene regulatory network, could learn to have a bad habit, right? So how much of our dis-ease, how much of our lack of health is just a bad habit that our system has learned, and there is actually no longer anything that is a pathological force making us sick, making us unwell, right, dysregulated. How much of it is our system has just learned to be that way, now it's just doing that, right? It's forgotten how to be healthy, it learned how to be unhealthy, now it's just doing that. Okay, so getting a little closer to home here in terms of what we do. So this is research by Earl Miller's team at MIT, and it fairly well encapsulates an example of what we do. Okay, so it goes kind of like this. So we kind of roughly start over here with that little representation of neural firing patterns, brain waves. Right? So you have groups of neurons that fire. As those neurons fire, they create an electrical field. So that's called local field potential. So that's what we measure when we do EEG. You're going to get to see Fran's brain up on the screen in a little bit. That's what we're going to be showing you, is that level of neural activity that is the firing patterns of the neurons as they form brain waves. Right? So we see that those brain waves, so those go over to the ephaptic coupling, and that's the ability of brain waves to modify brain activity. So the brain wave activity can alter the firing patterns that are happening in the neurons. Right? And then, not only that, but it can go further down, it can alter what's happening in the cell itself. So we can go from brain waves to neurons to cellular activity, right? And then, of course, that becomes a loop. So we often think about neurofeedback that we're affecting brainwave activity, right? But what Earl Miller's lab has shown is any point on this cycle, like any point could be your entry point. For us, our entry point is brain waves. But by accessing brain waves, we can change what's happening in terms of neural firing, so brain activity, and then all the way down to cellular activity. Right? So it's not just a hypothesis that something like neurofeedback can change your cells. It's a proven fact. Now the question is, closing that loop, becoming better and better at understanding what you're doing at the level of the brain wave, to have what effect at the level of the cell, to have what level with effect within the cell, right? That's still open to research, but that loop happens. We absolutely know that it does, and this same idea is equally supported in Michael Levin's work. They're different mechanisms, but of approach. So how to interact is different, but the mechanism of action is not different, right? Changing the bioelectric field. So here's an example. What you see kind of on either side of that patch in the middle, which if you've never looked at EEG before, that patch in the middle might be attention getting. You might look at that and be like, oh, that doesn't look right, right? So what you see before it and what you see after it is kind of normal EEG, right? It's pretty well organized, has what we call a morphology to it. And so you see that it looks fairly structured and organized, neat and tidy, and then it looks quite messy, and then it goes back to neat and tidy, right? And so mostly what we expect EEG to look like is neat and tidy, right? But then we have somebody like this client who has what's called a paroxysm, or just kind of a burst of disorganization within the brainwaves. And then for this person, that would happen, not maybe about every minute to every 2 minutes, right? So their brain is having about a 2 minute, like a 2 minute little spasm, or a 2 second spasm about every 2 minutes, right? As presumably as they live their life, certainly while they were doing the EEG. So if we think about how that brainwave activity affects brain functioning, affects cellular activity. So if your brain is having a moment of high amplitude disorganization about every minute, that effect is going to go through that whole cycle. It's going to change how the brain is firing, it's going to change how the cellular activity is, and then that loop is just going to go around, right? So this is a pattern of dysregulation that's going to echo through all levels, right? So we can think about this in terms of our brain-mind, that we could think about that local field potential as something beginning to approximate mind, right? But the neural firing, that's brain. Cellular activity, also brain. But right there, we see how close brain and mind are. If we think about them as kind of two distinct things, we can see right there in the brain, they're physically next to each other. But in that they affect one another, it's really hard to pull apart one from the other, right? Because they're mutually interacting, simultaneously affecting each other. Again, how do you really pull them apart, right? Okay, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own story here. So I'm going to use heart rate variability as an example. So this would be biofeedback versus neurofeedback, but same general idea. Operant conditioning, using information being fed back into the brain to make adjustments in the system, right? So heart rate variability, it's the beat to beat, the timing between beats of your heart. That should change a lot. A healthy heart rate variability is about 80 or higher. So the number that is used is called SDNN. Doesn't really matter, but let's just say something in the neighborhood of 50 and up, good, 50 and down, not so good. Higher is better, right? So for myself, I was an elite athlete for a number of years. I, not only trained physically, I ate a fairly rigorous diet, trained, cross types of training, running, gym. I was a competitive fighter, so in the gym fighting. So physical training, diet, exercise, all of that handled. During that same time, I was a meditator. I went on retreats on a regular basis. So we go have a 5-day retreat, sit, meditate, 8, 12 hours a day, organic food, doing all of the things, right? I was very fortunate over those years. I had many very good world-class meditation instructors. So I had excellent instruction, in that way. And so, I did 20, well, at that time, so 35 years of body work. So again, somatic therapies, receiving that work, so massage, acupuncture, Rolfing, you name it, go down the list, chiropractic care, all of it. Did 6 years of psychoanalysis, so laying on a couch, talking to myself, not really, there was somebody there, but basically if you do analysis, you're talking to yourself. 4 hours a week for 6 years. That is a lot of talking. So all of that. Fran and I started Bhakti Brain Health Clinic. We had all this great high-tech toys to play with. I wired myself up for HRV thinking, I've got this, right? Like my history tells me I am gonna have a stellar HRV, and it's 35, right? 35 is down in the area of like congestive heart failure. Give you an idea of how bad my HRV was, right? So for me, this was like a shocking discovery. Like, how is it even possible that somebody with that history could have an HRV that low, right? I work with athletes now, elite athletes for the most part, 100, 120 HRV, right? And then I'm down at 35. What is going on? So this was a really eye-opening experience, right, of how my early life experience, right, so how my childhood set kind of guardrails, what we call priors in my system, that no amount of training, again, elite level athlete at the Olympic Training Center, training with the best, elite meditator, training with the best, didn't make a dent in this system in my body. Right? So that was stunning. So I started to do for myself what we do with our clients. I started doing training. And it took a lot for me to get my HRV from like, say 35, even up to 40, like to just even get the line to like wiggle. But again, shocking for me was just a little change, the feeling that had in my body. And what that was, like just enough of a change for me to realize that all of my time meditating and all of my sense of like just really being at ease and tranquil and inner peace and samadhi and all of that wonderfulness, like I had not moved the needle one iota, shifting my system, my heart rate variability, and actually changing the harmony in my autonomic nervous system, immediate experiential difference. And in that moment, the awareness of how I have not been there before. Yep. So what this did for me was it really had me reframe how I looked at everything that I had done to this point, right? So at that point, not quite 30 years of experience, my own students, 20 years of teaching meditation, right? All of that was immediately called into question, because if I'm doing everything that I've been saying at scale with the best people and it hasn't made a dent, what was I doing? And really, what, as a practitioner, what am I doing if I'm talking to my clients about meditate and let's do breathing and all of those things are great and wonderful, do some yoga. The problem is absent some feedback, right? So now what I understand when somebody says you should meditate, if your goal is to meditate to get something out of it, right, it's essentially like going into a dark room with a handful of darts. Someplace in there is a dartboard. Good luck hitting it. That's meditation for something like anxiety, right? If your goal is lowering your anxiety and your method is going to be meditation, you're in a dark room with a handful of darts and you don't know where the board is. What are the chances you're going to hit a bullseye? Really small, right? And that was my experience. Right? So we're going to do a little, you guys are going to have a chance to do a little experiment here. It won't entirely come clear until the end of the little video we're going to watch, about 5 minutes. But then we're going to circle back and have a little conversation about what just happened.
Even though your brain is more remarkable than the most powerful computer in the world, it is possible to trick that very brain of yours. Have a look at this. What can you see? Oh, you say that's easy. I can see a window going around. Is it rotating or no? It paused. Now it's going the other way. Okay, so we're watching a window that's going backwards and forwards. Pauses again. Now it goes back the other way. Backwards and forwards all the time, oscillating. Are you sure that's what you're seeing? In fact, you're looking at an optical illusion that was invented by Adelbert Ames back in 1951, and it's quite a remarkable illusion. If we stop the window now, you'll notice that it was rotating the same direction all the time on a turntable, same way all the time, but it isn't a rectangle. You assumed that it was a window, so it must be a rectangle. Oh, no, it isn't. Look at that end there, quite short. This end, quite large. In fact, it's a trapezoid. A trapezoid, a strange shape. Not a rectangle, though. But because we've seen so many windows in our lives, we assume that they're all rectangular. And you can see that I've painted this window on a flat piece of cardboard to look like a real window. In fact, I've painted the cross pieces so that they appear to be three-dimensional. I've even painted in the shadows that you might get if you had a light from above. Okay, now you know it's an illusion. You know it's not a window, it's a flat piece of cardboard. You also know that it's a trapezoid, it's not a rectangle. So now the illusion won't work with you, will it? Or will it? Have a look at it again. Well, this really is quite crazy, isn't it? We know all about the illusion now. It shouldn't work on us, and yet it still does. We still see the window going backwards and forwards. Look at that. It's appearing to pause now, and now change direction and go back the other way. Even though we know, because we've seen it on the turntable, we know that it's rotating in the same direction all the time. Well, I think the problem is we don't have a reference point. What we need to do is to attach something to the window, so we'll stop it now and attach a matchbox to one end. We'll attach it to the short end here with a paper clip. And then all you need to do is to watch that matchbox and use that as your point of reference. So this time the illusion won't trick you, or will it? Watch this. Now there's the matchbox going around the back of the window. Keep watching it. Now look what happens. The window appears to pause and go backwards, but the matchbox keeps coming and floats out past this edge of the window and rejoins the other edge of the window. Watch it again. Goes around the back. Firmly attached to the window, you can see that. But here's the crazy part. The window appears to stop, to pause, and then go backwards. But the matchbox just keeps on coming, floating through space. I think maybe the problem is we have our reference point attached to the window. Let's stop it, take the matchbox off, and this time put on a reference point through the center of the window. What I'll use is a ruler, wooden ruler, can't bend, and I'll attach it right to the center of the window in this position here. Now this time you watch the ruler. You know it can't bend, so this time I'm sure we will defeat the illusion. What do you think? Here we go. Now there's the window, rotating. So is the ruler. It's attached to the window. But what's happening here? The window's going backwards, the ruler's still coming, and now it goes somehow or other through the window itself. Really crazy. The window pauses again, ruler keeps coming. Ruler's attached to the window, you can see that. You can even see the pin. But watch what happens here. The ruler's coming, window pauses, window goes backwards, and somehow or other they go through each other, even though you know they can't do it. What a crazy illusion Adelbert Ames invented, because we're so used to seeing windows which are rectangular. If the same illusion is taken to a tribe in the middle of Africa where they haven't seen rectangular windows, it doesn't work for them. They see it rotating around and around and around, whereas we see it going backwards and forwards all the time. It's going backwards, the ruler's still coming, and now it goes somehow or other through the window. Watch what happens here. A crazy illusion Adelbert Ames invented.
So again,
because we're
you can
so
watch
used
that
to seeing
turning.
Windows which are rectangular.
At the same time you're watching that turning, that you're knowing this thing's going in a circle, that looks like it's going back and forth.
They see it rotating around and around and around,
so your
whereas we see it
mind
going backwards and forwards all the time.
is seeing the impossible and you're just like okay with it, right? Even faced with just the obvious facts, besides him telling you, right? Even when you're sitting and watching one turn all the way and the other, your mind is still like, nah, no, it's going back and forth, right? Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. So is there anybody who it wasn't going back and forth for? Kind of do our blue white dress thing? Yeah. Almost? You almost did? Yeah. So I mean, it's I think the illusion itself is interesting. I find what's more interesting is at the very end when he talks about, people in other cultures, people who are not raised in a structured, a built environment, they just see it go around, right? So what does that tell you about us, right? Our priors, that word I mentioned before, right? How we're programmed. We're programmed so well because we've been born and raised in built environments that have squares, corners, angles, windows, squares, right? So our mind and our brain have been so programmed with that even when somebody tells us what we should be seeing, we can't see it. When you try and see what's actually there, you can't do it. You can't overcome those priors. And I don't want to say can't, because it is possible. It's just really hard. That's the main point, right? And that's the way it was for me when I did all of my meditation and all of my psychoanalysis and all of my exercising. None of that overcame the priors of my early life experience, right? My nervous system's conviction that the world isn't safe, and therefore, no matter how much training I did, my heart is just like, or really my autonomic nervous system. It's like, nope, don't care, not listening. This is the truth. It's not safe. Yep. So, and again, why, what Fran and I do, like how come it's helpful? Yes, please.
So you keep mentioning that all of the things like meditation, being an athlete, all those things didn't have any effect on it, but since you didn't get to do a reading of it before, how can you say that? I feel like it would have had some type of effect on it.
So are you saying if I had done the biofeedback like in the midst of it, like when I was 25?
In your childhood, and then recording the progress with doing all those things, because how can you say that it didn't already increase it by doing the meditation and the healthy eating?
Sure, I'm with you. One of the reasons is mine's so low, I'm like right at the bottom of the scale, right? Like right next to congestive heart failure. So I'm pretty sure I don't function like a person who's actually that sick, right? But my heart rate variability says like that's how unwell my autonomic nervous system is that. So what should have happened was, say, being an elite athlete, that should have strengthened my autonomic nervous system such that my HRV was 100, but it didn't. Is that making sense? Or, yeah, maybe, sort of?
Or if you hadn't done it, your HRV would have been 6.
It's
You did all those things.
Yep.
That's kind of
Yeah,
higher.
it's-
Except that, like, 35 is basically.
yeah, you can't get much lower. Yeah, like that, like if it was 50, right, and I was just kind of like normal healthy, I'd be like, well, but I'm right down at the bottom, like much worse, and then you're dead.
What was the word you used that people around 35 have that you didn't?
Congestive heart failure. Yeah. So it's your heart's barely functioning.
You said that you don't function.
So my heart is actually really healthy, right? But my
That was from the meditation.
absolutely could be the fact that my heart is as healthy as it is because of that. But the thing that kind of drives my entire metabolism, right? That's again, so HRV is all-cause mortality, not heart health, but all. So we know statistically people with low HRVs die young and have multiple health conditions. And generally, when they have an encounter with the health system, their outcomes are poorer than people with higher HRVs. So we know that the HRV is a good metric for what's called all-cause mortality. So just generally your expression of health, vitality, resilience. So although my heart is healthy, the more important function in my system, my autonomic nervous system, not good. Yep. So yeah, I do think that I did benefit in other ways, but in this core way, nope. Yep. Yep. It's a good question though. I mean, all of that deserves like clear thinking. Yep. So I was saying something. I'm sure it was going to be interesting. I am sure of it, but your question was more interesting. So thank you. So what Fran and I do is we're able to take, certain measurements of the system, whether it's brain waves or if it's biofeedback, we can take the biometrics, and we can kind of get an objective measure of function in the system, and then we can give that feedback so that a person can make objective change and not only have the subjective sense that change may or may not be happening. So it isn't just doing the action that's supposed to be good for you, but not knowing if it is. It's being able to do that and find out if it is. Right? And to me, that was the piece that brought it all together, because now I can do craniosacral therapy with my clients, but I can do craniosacral therapy with them wired up to biofeedback and maybe doing paced breathing and have my results be much more than they would have been without adding that piece in. Right? And that's what I've kind of seen in my practice, is bringing those pieces together just produces better outcomes. Okay, so we're going to go to Fran and a little bit of a demonstration here. So to do that, we're going to just have to do a little technical switch around here and get Adam's computer up on the screen. So Adam, I'm going to give you this. There you go. And wish us well in our technological transition here. It's always a little iffy. Okay. So Adam, are you still in that browser? Okay. So what I might need to do is re-invite you. Oh. So, okay, you're up here, but you're not in the Riverside, correct? Is that true? That's a question. Or are you able to get in? Okay, so then I'm going to do the same thing I did before, which is, or what Fran did, is I'm going to post it into the RingCentral. So you might, yeah, just. So we're just going to get Adam in, so Adam can share his screen into the live stream. There we go. Okay, so turning on your camera. Okay. Okay, great. So, okay, so you guys have the wonderful opportunity to get to see Fran's brain in action. So there it is. So earlier when I was talking about the local field potential in that slide from MIT, so this is what we're measuring here. Okay? And again, how as we train in neurofeedback, this is what we're training. But again, now we know this has a downward causation effect, so affecting the neural firing patterns and all the way down to the cellular metabolism. So what we're going to be watching for here is if I feel a little bit like we're at the zoo, and we're just going to see if the lion is going to come out or not. So we're going to be looking primarily here in alpha. We might also see it in beta, what's called a mu rhythm. So you'll see these two, right? So you see a little bit of it right there. It's kind of faint, a little bit of it right there. But these two light up. There it is. In what is called a mu rhythm. Yeah, so we get a little bit more. So I'll say a little bit. So a mu rhythm. Mu, M-U, so Greek number. So mu. And it's when these two areas, so this is over what's called the motor strip, so across the center of the brain here, the motor strip. When these two areas kind of crosstalk too much, that's called a mu rhythm. And then what a mu rhythm is often will bring about in the brain is what's called frontal lobe disengagement. Right? So we'll say somebody is mewing and they have frontal lobe disengagement. Frontal lobe disengagement is a nice way of saying dissociation. Right? Now, we do make a distinction because just like kind of powering down the frontal lobe doesn't necessarily mean dissociation, but that is kind of the general implication in the literature is a mu rhythm will lead to dissociation. And so this is something that when Fran and I were training, so in our early years, both not just learning how to do this, but we actually trained each other in doing neurofeedback, that Fran came to see that she has a mu rhythm. And so part of our work together was me asking Fran when her brain would be mewing, and I would say, mewing. And then she would pair that with the conscious experience, right? And that took a long time, like many, many, many sessions, and many times me saying, mew, 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 for her to begin to be like, oh, that experience, that's what you mean. And then once she was able to identify it, what's called the quali, right? The experience, right, of the mu, then she could start to kind of operate on it, right? So what we were doing, to me this is a great example of kind of brain-mind, right? So what we're seeing here is her brain mewing. We haven't seen a really good mew yet. Like, so I don't know if you're already doing this, but just let yourself zone out. Zone out, like, so, yeah, that's true. It's true. I'll tell you a story and you'll be mewing like that. Yeah, so there we go. A nice, good mew come up there. So as part of that experience, so I'm watching her brain, and as I'm seeing that brain, and then I'm talking to her, and now I'm recruiting her mind, right, to have some sense of her experience. So this larger organizing principle. Right? And her mind was able to tap into the experience of the mu, and then give a first-person report of what mu felt like. And then over time, her experience of the mu has, I don't know, maybe deepened, probably better you can say. So I'll let you go ahead and tell a little bit of your story of the inner experience of mu.
Yeah, so when I first started playing it, it felt to me yeah, but that checking out to me has a conscious component to it, and there was nothing about it that was conscious. It just was my brain was going off on, literally kind of just. And blissfully in the early days.
Yeah, so we generally think of mu as an adaptive pattern that the brain, a strategy the brain found because of an early environment that was not all that supportive and may have been like demonstrably unsupportive. And that as a way to deal with that environment, the brain found this pattern of mu rhythm to disengage frontal lobes and kind of check out. And it makes sense that it has a kind of a bliss to it because of just the internal like pleasure seeking and pain avoidance, that's what the brain has created for itself. And then we do find like it's often a pattern that we'll see in people who have been diagnosed with ADHD is that they will have a a mu rhythm, and then not that that isn't ADHD, but it's a specific something that we can look at, identify, and then we know how to resolve. So Adam, do you want to pull up air? And then we'll just do a little bit of what do we do? And this is one of the approaches for it. We have many approaches, but we're going to do one of the approaches. Did I see a hand? Yeah.
And you tell me this for later, but I'm starting to get a feeling that, we all, at my age, at least, right now, we've all come through a lot of things. Most people haven't had like perfectly easy lives with no trauma, or they haven't gotten the help they needed when they needed to, and so what it seems like, I don't know if you're saying that a lot of this dysregulation happens when you're younger, and then once you get a chance to train it, then it's like you have that baby brain again? No. The brain that works, I don't know.
So I'm going to answer. Yeah. So I don't know that this is going to be an answer to your question, but here's where my brain went, or my mind. I don't know. So yes, we've developed these patterns of compensation. So let's say in Fran's case, talking about this mu rhythm. So when she trains, so go ahead and fire it up, Adam. We'll get that going. What she's training against here, right, or training towards, is a normative database of age and gender matched neurotypical brains, right? So this is helping her brain build, pardon the word, normal neural infrastructure, right? So to give her brain an option of a pattern of wiring that is more optimal. And the brain, being kind of an optimization engine, is going to choose that. It's going to say, oh, like this neural pattern is more functional. So I'm going to choose this. It will slowly prune over time the old through disuse. So that pattern of mewing will get pruned over time. The pattern of more optimal neural functioning will get wired in day by day, hour by hour. That pattern will get more and more wired. So it's not so much that she'll have a baby brain as she will have a optimized neural pattern based on an age and gender matched peak performance brain database.
And I'm sorry, that baby brain is regulated. I wasn't.
No, but it's an important. I think it's an important point in what we do is what a person gets is a functional neural pathway. They don't just get their old pathway pruned, right? You get a functional pathway built in its place, and that's part of the gift of neurofeedback. In terms of you don't have to take the time that it would take to grow it naturally. You can expedite that process. So what we're seeing here is the more Fran's brain does what the database is asking. Adam, can you slide over a little bit so we can see the maps up there? So the more Fran's brain does what the database is asking, the bat flies straight. When it wobbles, that's feedback to her brain saying, no, not like that. So when it's going straight, it's saying yes, like that. When it wobbles, it says, no, not like that. And then the pattern of neural firing is being conditioned through this process. Series of essentially kind of yes, 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 no, yes, no, 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 yes, no, like that, session to session, minute to minute. And my guess is if we let Fran kind of get into this for a little bit, we'll start to see the mu pop up a bit more. I've seen a few more instances of it. Yeah. So good question. So I would say to some degree in its purest sense, we don't want it to be a conscious process, and we don't really want her to have anything that seems like control. We want her eyes on the screen so that her brain is getting feedback real time of its activity, and the brain is modifying itself. And not that the mind can't be participant, but early when we're training people, one of the first things that we need to do is train people out of the habit of using their mind, right? Thinking that they can control it, that they somehow they can, whatever. If I put my tongue over here, or people come up with all kinds of fantasies, right? About, well, I was thinking about camping and it went through, so I'm going to think about camping more, like that. So a lot of it is actually teaching people the difference between their brain and their mind, and then getting them to kind of set their mind aside and really just let the brain do its thing. And then later, for some folks who are able to kind of make this adjustment, they can start to bring their mind back in, and the mind can be supportive of the process. But in the beginning, the mind is always an interference. So the example we use is pretend you're watching a friend play a video game, right? The friend is your brain, you're the mind. You're there, you're supporting them, but you're not getting between them and the TV. You're not slapping the joystick out of their hand, right? You're just cheering them on. That's the role we want the mind to play. Yeah.
So you said that the universe is rhythm, right? I'm guessing that kind of entails that there's multiple rhythms that the brain has. What specific rhythm is the system trying to get your brain to do?
Yep, great question. So it's being compared to a normative database of somebody else, so a peak performance brain that was sitting doing nothing. So what we call resting attention. So just the neurotypical pattern of firing of a state of resting attention. That's what her brain is being trained against. Yep. So her brain is getting feedback for any activity that the database hasn't been cultivated, curated to consider kind of normal resting state brain activity.
So what is it shooting towards? Like mindfulness? Like, do you have like a way to describe it?
Yeah, well, I mean, so So resting state is the state. Like it's its own state. Like you said, mindfulness, that's its own state. That's not like a resting state. So resting state is like the brain idling. Like it's running, but it's not driving. Like your car could be driving, but if it's just sitting idling, that's idling. So we're training towards the normative database. We're training towards an ideal of a resting state. Yep. Now, there are other ways to do neurofeedback. This is just one way, right? We can do like surface training where we try and get a certain part of the brain to produce more alpha, or we can do phase coupling where we want this part of the brain to talk to that part of the brain in a very specific way. And then there's rationales for all of that. Like, why would we want this Brodmann area to talk to that Brodmann area in a very specific way? Say it's about improving short-term memory or motor function, or a long list of possibilities. Okay, so Heidi's been cueing me for a while that we're at time, so we're probably at time. Any questions about what you're seeing up here or anything that we've said, or, yeah?
I'm still kind of stuck
Mhm.
So, like when I say like, my hair has a mind of its own, that's probably true.
Yes.
Sounds like what we heard is he has a cure for cancer, cure for autism, he can regrow limbs. Why would he still have Alzheimer's?
Excellent question. Just to say the question, so if Michael Levin is doing all these wonderful things, why don't we have them yet? Yep. So I would say the process of research and development, then the process, and they're not there yet, but they're in the phase 1 of this, then will come FDA clearance and all of that. But so in an amphibian model, they had showed limb regeneration, right? So they've nailed that in an amphibian model. Now they've moved to a mouse model, so now they're into mammals. They've been able to get a mouse to regrow half a leg. So they're still tweaking the process to be able to get a mouse to grow a whole leg. So that's where they are in terms of the development. From the cancer standpoint, they've actually been able to show across multiple animals, so they're into mammals there. I would say they're probably beginning to orient towards human trials in that, but again, it'll be really early on, in that process. So they have started a couple of companies. So for-profit companies that are doing fundraising to do this outside of the academic setting, on both the limb generation and on the cancer side. So there's a lot of momentum moving in these directions because of what they've been able to show in their academic research, kind of proof of concept, that they've got a lot of attention. And you've got labs now all over the world reproducing his work. So yeah. I mean, one of my favorites of one of his experiments, they did this in a frog. So they introduced in a young frog, in a tadpole, so a teratogen, so that that frog would develop brain damage. So sure enough, grew into an adult frog with brain damage, basically just sat there. Right? So then, again, he did his bioelectric thing, so started the algorithm for grow a brain here. So you can see if you look at his online information, they have MRI images of this brain regenerating. That frog goes on to be a normal, happy adult frog with a typical IQ. And yes, they have created devices to be able to measure, like, salamander IQ and fish IQ and all of that. So yeah, to be able to see an animal with brain damage, and then that brain regenerates, and then that animal goes on to be a normal adult frog. Absolutely amazing. Yeah. So I think there's a whole lot of promise that's happening there in his lab. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you all. And if I will someplace in here. I think Adam. I can get my screen back there. Great. Oh, that's right. I forgot. I don't have the thing anymore.